Hello and welcome to this week's update in my role as Laoghaire-Rathdown musician in residence. This week I'm going to talk about a couple of different things which relate to the piece I've been composing for the residency, Dunleary Guitars. They're improvisation and also what I call textural guitar playing. I'll explain a bit more about what that is later. And I've shared two blog posts, one last week about jazz and this week there's one about textural guitarists, and they're both relevant to what I'm talking about this week. So if you go to daveflynn.com blog, click on the blog there and you'll see the playlists and me talking about them one after another. And so improvisation and how it relates to the piece. So I talked before about how the piece opens with this chord, which is a C major 7 chord, which is commonly found in jazz, lots of music styles, but it's these major 7 chords are one of the kind of foundational chords to a lot of jazz. And so if you were to improvise just over that chord, for instance, you could just use a C major scale. You could base your improvisation completely around that scale, and just you could switch notes around, and like instead of playing it as a scale, you could just move between, say that scale has the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C again, and up, the same notes going up higher. So you could just switch between the notes like just randomly picking a note to go to. But then you can also change the rhythm, so and that doesn't sound too far removed from something like Baroque music, or but then you can swing the rhythm along with that. You're swinging, that's just giving a bit of a different dancey kind of like emphasis to the rhythm. And swing, of course, is a really important element of jazz, but also other styles like Irish traditional music and some kind of rock and pop music. The swing is very common. But what I just did there is another way you can elaborate on it, is what they call chromatic movement. So that's kind of the notes that aren't in the C major scale. If you can add them in, and as kind of what they call passing notes. So if I was to add them into there, so you're getting, if you're kind of familiar with jazz in any way, you're getting closer to a typical kind of jazz sound there, because chromatic movement is really important in jazz. So if the harmony at the start was just this chord, the C major 7 chord, you could solo like that for the entire time. But actually, in the way I've composed the piece with multiple guitars, the harmony is going to be slightly different than just that chord, because I've done something what it's kind of modal harmony, as some people would call it, or polychords is another way of putting it. It's like, so while two guitarists are playing this chord harmony, another two guitarists at the beginning do what they would call a B minor triad to a D major triad. And that gives a sound a bit like... That changes the sound a bit, and when all the guitars together are doing it, there's a section in the piece where I call for a few of the guitarists to do solos, and the rest of the guitarists, when combined, come up with a kind of a sound like this. And so that's kind of the modal or polychordal harmony. And to me, the nicest kind of idea of a scale to use over that is what they call the Lydian Mode, a C Lydian Mode. And that's, you move away from a major scale, and what all you do is you change the C, or sorry, the F, the fourth note of the scale, and you make that F an F sharp, so you get this sound. So it's just a slightly different sound, but it's kind of significant in terms of how you'd approach improvising. And there's something about this Lydian sound that makes me fall into playing intervals of fourths and thirds. It just seems to be in the sound, the fourths, and some great jazz musicians like Miles Davis and John Coltrane would have done these kind of modal improvising, and it was kind of a innovation in the 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s, that kind of time in jazz. And that's probably my favorite type of jazz is modal jazz. You just kind of get these extended solos that can be kind of hypnotic just over a simple chord progression. And that's so that's an element of improvisation in the piece I've composed. And another thing you can think of when you're improvising over that chord is a D mixolydian. I might have talked, I think I talked about mixolydian before, relating it to Irish traditional music. It's quite commonly used in Irish trad, but it's also a common thing in jazz and improvisation styles. And if you combine the C Lydian mode with the D mixolydian mode when you're improvising over this kind of a progression, you can come up with some nice things. So you start thinking in D Lydian first, always referencing that C, and then you move to a D. So like I'm totally just improvising there. I'm it's just coming out of my mind. I'm not prepared anything there, and when you really are in the zone, as they say, you can come up with some really nice things when you're improvising, and they can either stand as their own as just pieces of music, as compositions, at the spontaneous compositions, or they can lead you into composing something more definite written down or recorded. That's a composition in itself as well. And often when I'm composing, I'll start just improvising with the guitar like that. It's hard to teach improvising. It's something I think you kind of need to have a bit of a natural talent towards it. I'm not really a jazz player myself, so I wouldn't consider myself anywhere near as good as some of the great jazz improvisers in that realm, but I would have more improvising ability, I'd say, than the average classically trained musician, because improvisation isn't very commonly taught in or used even in the classical music scene. There's elements of improvisation in contemporary classical music, and then also in early music, and there are some brilliant improvisers in classical music, but generally I've noticed that a lot of conservatory trained classical musicians find quite difficult to improvise. They don't know where to start, so hopefully some of what I've said might be helpful there. So that's a bit about improvisation and how I've used it in the piece, and I'd like to continue a bit on the jazz realm a bit, because before I move on to the textural guitars, because one of the styles I mentioned in my blog there is bossa nova, Brazilian style of composing. It's kind of Brazilian jazz is another way you could call it, and there's kind of a fusion of jazz kind of approaches to harmony and kind of traditional Brazilian kind of folk and street music styles that developed in the late 50s and 60s with especially with the composer Antonio Carlos Jobim and other great composers like Louis Bonfa and João Gilberto and Astrid Gilberto, the singer who is famous for singing The Girl from Ipanema. That's probably the most famous bossa nova song. You might have heard it. And so that style, Brazilian, if you imagine that song I just played, imagine that was played in a old swing jazz style, like Parisian swing. The guitarist would probably go and that's all straight on the beat. It's like dum, boom, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But when Brazilians kind of decided to make their own version of jazz, they used these syncopated rhythms, is what they're called. Syncopated means it's off the main beat. So well, the bass line there is always on the beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, but the higher notes in the chord are off the beat a lot of the time. Kind of giving more emphasis to the offbeats. 1, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. It's on the and of a beat, so you often count beats 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So you kind of have to develop a bit of a develop your approach to rhythm a bit. If you've never done something like this before, it takes a bit of time to get it in your fingers to separate the two kind of rhythms. And so I'm not really using that kind of syncopation in this piece I've been composing, but what bossa nova did influence in the piece is the chord progression. And I by myself I studied a lot of the compositions of Jobim and people like that, and Louis Bonfa a good few years ago, and I picked up a lot of nice ways of putting harmonies together from that, and So if you can imagine that the chord progression that I showed a few weeks ago for the piece, imagine it's a bossa nova. I'll play it kind of quickly just to get it over with. But so you might do it like this. So it's an interesting kind of example of style and how you can use the same chord progression and change it into a different style if you feel like. So, in a few years' time, I might decide, hey, I want to turn this piece into a bossa nova, and there you could do it like that. So that's just a bit about bossa nova and improvising and jazz. So now I'm going to move on to textural guitar playing. And on the blog post I've just shared some info about some of my favourite guitarists in the realms of textural guitar. And what I mean by textural guitar playing is that instead of like playing solos and more kind of obvious kind of strumming chord patterns and kind of virtuosity and that kind of thing, there's a kind of a group of guitarists over the years who play what I'd say they play in service to the song and or the piece of music, and they're not trying to show off or anything. They're just coming up with nice textures and often combining different guitars. Maybe if it's one guitarist, they might overdub different guitar parts against each other, or it can be a group with a few different guitarists just playing off each other, but not really soloing, not doing anything technically mind-blowing, but it's in terms of songcraft and composition, it can be really, really beautiful. And I mentioned a few weeks ago Andy Summers from The Police, and he's maybe one of the kings of textural guitar playing, and he influenced an awful lot of people. And I think textural guitar playing reached its kind of peak in the 80s when some guitar players were combining effects pedals and like echoes and things called a chorus and a flanger. I can't demonstrate them on a nylon string guitar, but if you listen to some of the stuff on the blog that I've shared, then you'll get a sense of those sounds, and you'll know those sounds anyway because they're on the radio all the time. But where I think this kind of sound of textural guitar playing originated was probably Pet Sounds, the great album by the Beach Boys, and that has some fantastic guitar players on it. And if you listen to the album a couple of times, you may not even notice the guitars too much. They're not there to be heard like solo kind of things. They're just part of the overall texture melding with other instruments. But then if you kind of listen closely, you'll hear these beautiful guitar lines that are kind of that might be going, and then up here to be so the two of them, those sounds combined, create this really chiming, hypnotic kind of sound. Especially then on the orchestration that Brian Wilson did with them, there's percussion bell-like sounds and harpsichords and things. So it creates this beautiful textured sound. And it's a kind of a sound that I'm influenced by a lot. And going further forward into the 80s then, after Andy Summers, the combination, I'd say, of Andy Summers and Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds kind of thing would have influenced a lot of guitarists in the 80s, and like some of my favourites would be like Robin Guthrie from the Cocteau Twins, who maybe brought that sound into a more experimental sphere and using a lot of really heavy effects. And then like The Edge from U2. I don't like U2 so much anymore, but I love their album The Unforgettable Fire, and the Edge does some great guitar textures on that album. And there's Charlie Burchill from Simple Minds, and in the early days Simple Minds were quite an experimental band before they became kind of stadium filling rock band. But some of their earlier records, Charlie Burchill does very unusual guitar kind of textures, and apparently he influenced The Edge a bit on that. And there's a lot more textural guitar players on the list on the blog. I won't go into them all now. You can read up on that if you're interested in it. But anyway, just to say a bit about how I've brought these kind of textural guitar things into this piece. So there's 8 guitar players in the piece altogether, so that gives possibility for really nice textures. And towards the end of the piece, over that chord progression, over that, so when 2 guitarists are doing those chords, another 2 are doing a bass line, and then the other guitarists, some of them are doing kind of melodic lines, and then others are doing these textured lines. Like one might be going like, some might be doing something simple like that. So it's more like this actually. Just repeating that kind of over and over. So then that might merge with something like this in another guitar. And then another guitar might be doing something like this. And it's hard to get a sense of what the 3 of them together sound like, but when you hear the final composition, you'll understand. It just is kind of merging web of sound. It's kind of a rolling sea of sound almost when the 3 different things are. This one is in a slightly different rhythm. So it's like it's at a different speed, like 2 people walking at different speeds, and one passes the other out. So that's one example of the textured guitars. Another in the that's in the second movement of the piece. In the first movement of the piece, the Dunleary Harbour eventually goes into a kind of a sound where what I call a polymetric cycle. Now this is very technical, but where you have 2 different rhythms, 2 different beats, completely different rhythms going against each other, but eventually they meet up. Like, so one pattern, it's a pattern of notes, might repeat 5 times, and the other pattern of notes might repeat 6 times, but because of the lengths of the patterns, they'll coincide in a cycle. It's almost like, 2 people walking side by side. One is much taller than the other and has less steps to take to get to a certain point, so they might take them 10 steps and the person beside them 12 steps, but they'll meet at that point. So that's what a polymetric cycle is. And so I've got, like, here's a cycle of 5 notes in 5 beats, a 5-beat pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then against that you can put 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you've got 6 against 5 there. It's quite hard to put these two together, but so it meets up in a pattern eventually. And so that's an effect I use quite a bit in some of my compositions. It's something I thought I invented years ago when I was younger, but then I found out that other people did it before me. And it's even found in some forms of really ancient drumming music in Africa. This effect of different rhythms piling up on top of each other. So that's my update. That's a bit about textural guitar and jazz guitar playing, and we're nearly coming. We've a couple of weeks to go till the premiere now, and so we're going to get down to starting to record the music now, video it. I'll be over the next week or so doing videos of my parts, and then Kieran and his students are going to be working away on their videos, and then we have someone to put them together and combine them into the video to premiere. And so that's my update for this week. And again, if you have any questions, queries about what I've been doing, please just you can put a comment under the posts, the social media posts, or the YouTube clips, and or you can email me if you like, dave@daveflynn.com. And so I'd like to end this week. I'm going to improvise something, and I'm going to improvise using the chord progression, and I'm going to improvise in a kind of a slow style, almost like a jazz ballad style. I'm just coming up with it here based on these chords. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to dedicate this to my uncle Noel, who passed away last week, and he was a lovely man, and I really miss him. And so this is just a tune for Noel.